Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I've been running this channel for a little bit now, and when I started it, I really only wanted to do reviews of high-level tournament footage. And that was for a reason, because I believe that there was something to be learned and gained from interpreting the techniques and action selection of high-level tournament fighters as it pertains to maybe improving your own fighting or improving your own success in tournaments. But every once in a while, I realize that most people do not fence at this level. Most people do not fence the people who are at this level. And the result is that there's a bit of an information gap. While there's plenty of stuff online about how to get into HEMA and stuff covering the very, very basics, there isn't really much in that intermediate level. And one of the things I like to do is interpret footage. And I realize that despite the fact that I do this all the time, I've never actually laid out exactly why or how I do this. So I thought I'd take an opportunity when there's currently a gap, because I'm still waiting for Gazelle Infectin's footage, that I would interpret some free sparring here and talk a little bit about not only how I interpret things, but why I do them in these particular ways. So to start off, I like to break down every single longsword exchange into three distinct categories: shot selection, distance and timing, and errors. And the reason I break it down that way is specifically because I believe these are the three categories that, when watching your own footage, you can look back on and make decisions about how you can change up your own training so that you can make better decisions in the future. Shot selection is pretty obvious. It pertains to the exact technique that you used in the instance or in the sequence of the exchange. So for example, you come forward, you throw your right Zverk, and then you got parried, and then you threw a left Zverk and you landed it. Great. Those are your shot selections. But you also want to make sure that you include defenses as well in your understanding of shot selections. Did you throw a wall parry? Did you throw a cron parry? Did you just zorn your blade really, really hard into theirs? Any one of these things can lead to the exchange ending up the way that it ended up, but it also means that when you go back and go to your own training, you can work on specific techniques so that you can make them a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient, or work on the kind of flowchart style fencing where you understood what was going on and you made the right shot selection, but maybe there was something else wrong with it. Something else like the distance and timing. A lot of times people choose correct techniques to throw in an instance and in an exchange, but oftentimes it's the distance and the timing that is a little bit off. And the reason it's off is a lot of times because of footwork. If you're looking to improve your own footwork and you're watching your own footage, 90% of the time what you need to look at is not your actual feet, but the actual experience that you had during the exchange. For example, you threw that exact same right Zverk that I talked about earlier, but it completely whiffed. The reason it whiffed is because you probably weren't close enough. And the reality here is that the reason you weren't close enough is because you didn't use the correct footwork, either from yourself or from your opponent, to get yourself into that range. It's not the shot selection, it's the fact that you chose it at the wrong time. So one thing that you can do when you're going back and reviewing your own footage is any single time you watch something and you think, oh, well, it's not necessarily that the technique was wrong, it's that I wasn't in the right place at the right time. That doesn't mean that you should try to drill footwork. It actually means that you should go back and drill the technique even more, but in more live sparring scenarios. But the last category is errors. And in a lot of ways, this is the least and most important, because I put the following into the errors category: bad judging, bad directing, bad self-calling. Maybe you thought you landed something and then you stopped and your opponent hit you back and then their point got called and yours didn't. These are all things that happen that really have nothing to do with your own skill, but are just the random sorts of acts of God that happen when you're fencing in a tournament. And the reason they can be really unimportant is because they really have no pertinence to your training. You can't train a good judge to be there at the time of your exchange. You can't train a good director. You can't go back and practice enough footwork to the point where you didn't slip on the AstroTurf. But the most important aspect of errors is that sometimes there are errors that are implicit to the way that you approach a fight and your fight psychology. And I've talked about this before where, like I said in the example, you landed a hit and then you stopped. This is something that you can train out of yourself, but it's not by going back and doing any kind of technique work or footwork. It's you have to go in and you have to practice this stuff when you're doing free sparring or when you're doing tournament fencing. And it's really the only place to get that kind of training. And it's really the only place where you can find this kind of error, except for when you're watching your own tournament footage. So with that, I'm going to go through and I'm going to break down some of these exchanges in this stuff, but I'm also going to talk about it as it pertains to these three categories and talk a little bit more than I normally would about what you might want to do in order to improve the errors and the problems and the things that you want to change while you're watching footage. So we're going to interpret this first exchange along these three lines, and the first up is shot selection. What shots, which techniques did each person choose to use in order to get the better of this exchange? And we're going to focus on MJ here, who is on the left, and not Josh on the right. MJ took a step forward, at least in the exchange that ended this entire little thing. They took a hard left side wall parry. What I mean by that is they basically took their hands from their right plow or right vom tog, more or less, and just shoved it to their left side and created a wall on their left side. And the purpose of this, the reason they selected this particular technique, was because Josh was basically sticking his point in his face. The idea here is that Josh was threatening and provoking a reaction from MJ, and MJ's chosen reaction was to set that sword off to the side where it would be safe. At which point, Josh threw a kind of short, middling, not very well committed cut towards the hands, which was parried. However, at this point, MJ goes into a hanging parry and then comes out of it with a compass step and throws a nice big Oberhaut onto the opposite side. And as far as shot selection goes, this is a pretty classic play, a pretty classic sequence of techniques that works a lot of the time. But this one did not. And it didn't work because of the shot selection. Although, as I said earlier, one of the key components of any shot selection is that it be threatening. This was sufficiently threatening even though it missed. Because at the end of the day, what happened to Josh was that he threw a technique, he got parried by a hanging parry, and then there was a shot coming on his opposite side that he needed to take care of. Regardless of whether or not the tech lands, you still were threatened by it in that you had to throw a parry. So, shot selection-wise, everything here was great. What didn't work was the distance and the timing. And of course, why it didn't work in distance and timing was footwork. Specifically, the compass step that MJ took when he moved off to the side and threw his Oberhaut. Now, why is this a problem? A lot of times when people learn techniques, especially when they're newer, they learn a sequence of techniques that exists in the book as a play. But what the books never tell you is the footwork that goes in conjunction with it. And even when it does, sometimes it can lead you a little bit astray. And this is a classic example of that. There is nothing wrong with using a compass step in conjunction with an Oberhaut after a hanging parry. In fact, 90% of the time, this will actually augment your Oberhaut and make it far more likely to land. But what went wrong here was not, again, the shot selection, but the fact that in this particular instance, the compass step moved a little bit too far backwards at the exact same time that Josh, his opponent, moved backwards, which meant that at the end of his arc, he had no target to hit. The idea here is that footwork should always fit the technique, but it should always fit the situation. And the idea here is that there was no real reality where the selection of this particular compass step was going to result in the landed hit that MJ wanted, because the compass step in this particular instance always either moves to the side or backwards. You can't really move forward with it because you're only moving your back leg and you're crossing your feet. So what I would say is if you find yourself in this situation all the time, you have to make sure that your footwork is augmenting the kind of technique that you want at the end of your sequence of techniques. So for example, if you want to get better at this particular sequence, this particular play, what you need to do is you need to set up sparring games with your opponent where you tell them to throw a technique, you parry it with a hang and parry, and then you tell them to do any kind of erratic footwork that they think they want to do. They can move forward, they can move backward, they can move side to side, they can do all kinds of crazy stuff. And the reason you want them to do that is because you want to get into the habit of watching your opponent's footwork, and then as you throw your follow-up cut, your counter-attack, you need to make sure that you are doing the footwork that matches what they are doing. You can't simply follow the book play by play. And what a lot of new people need to understand, again, and learn about when they watch their own footage, is that oftentimes they're executing things in a prearranged sequence, and that if their opponent simply does something outside of that sequence, they are completely unable to match and they're completely unable to complete their technique. So in this next exchange, we are starting at the top as we always should with shot selection, and we're starting to see a pattern out of MJ here. We're seeing a pattern in that every single time MJ walks into measure, he does so with a right plow. He then winds his right plow up into a left ox as a way of keeping himself safe, either that or threatening a thrust to his opponent's head. At which point, when his opponent throws any kind of attack, he tries to parry it with a hanging parry, and then pulls out of that hanging parry with a counterattack cut on the opposite side that he just parried. And this, again, is a very classic thing that a lot of people are taught in longsword class because it works. And it works for a lot of really intelligent reasons. One, winding up into a left ox is a great way to set aside anybody who attacks you on your left side and then potentially stab them in the chest. Going from a left ox to a hanging parry is the best way to protect yourself on either side of your body once you're in that position. And follow-up cuts from hanging parries not only feel good, but come off really fast and effectively and can be used to attack many different lines. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem here is still, at the end of the day, shot selection. Not because the shots or the techniques individually are bad, but because they are repeating too much. This is another thing that I like to talk about a lot in my videos, but maybe people don't quite understand why I talk about it so much, and that is adapting to your opponent is the way that you can beat virtually anybody with any technique, regardless of how much faster or stronger or better than you they might be. Because at the end of the day, no matter how good you are at a certain set of techniques or a certain sequence of techniques, if the other person figures out that that's all you're going to do, they can and will start changing the way they fence based around that, and they will start winning. So, what do you say when you're in this position? The obvious answer is just to do something different. But the problem with that statement is that it's impossible to do something different if this is the only thing that you have really taught or taught yourself to do. So what you really have to do is, again, the solution is sparring games. You have to make sure that you develop certain techniques from the exact same positions that you're already in so that you have mix-ups. What's a mix-up? A mix-up is basically a fighting game term, but the idea is that every time MJ here goes from his right plow to his left ox, he tries to thrust or tries to parry in a hanging parry, and he needs one more option from that. What can it be? Well, the answer is that A, you can throw a cut while going from your right plow to your left ox rather than a thrust, and that way your opponent will have to do two different kinds of parries or keep two different kinds of parries in mind if they want to stay safe from this exact same transition. A basic clear-cut example would be throwing a right zwerg up into your left ox, and then from there maybe throwing a thrust or deciding whether or not you have to hang and parry out of that. A great little example of how you can adapt the exact same situations that you like to put yourself in and the techniques that you like to use without necessarily, changing the distance or the timing, but just changing some of the shot selections so that you end up in the same places that you feel comfortable in, but you do them in completely different ways so that your opponent can't keep doing the same defenses. So we've talked a little bit about shot selection and a little bit about distance and timing, but now we have to come to errors, and we have to talk about the most common error that I see in most people's footage, and that is they stop when they think something happened. This is absolutely something you should never do, but it's easy to point out and show a piece of footage where somebody stopped where they thought something happened and go, don't do that, but it's a lot harder to understand why it's happening. And I've talked a little bit about it already, but psychologically, something happens when you're in the middle of a sparring match that is different than what is happening psychologically when you're in a tournament match. A lot of people psychologically want to win a fight, but they don't necessarily want to win sparring. Hopefully, when you're going into sparring, you're trying to work on certain things as opposed to winning. But what I propose is that we put a little bit of that sparring psychology into tournaments, and most importantly, a little bit of that tournament psychology back into sparring. Yes, you should absolutely be working on something when you're sparring and not trying to win. However, not trying to win doesn't mean that you are going to just let every single thing that goes through register on your Richter scale as a full counted point. You have to be able to discern the difference between something that would have counted in a tournament versus something that's going to count here. And that doesn't mean you have to start ripping off your mask and screaming every time you land something in sparring. What it means is that you have to not stop when you think that you've landed something, and you have to not stop when you think your opponent lands something, but you have to do it in such a way that it stays friendly and it stays safe. And here's how you can start doing it. What you want to do is you want to look at this exchange exactly as it happened. Josh threw some attacks from the right, landed on MJ's arms a little bit, at which point MJ stopped. But he didn't just stop. He started walking backwards and he continued to parry. This is a great example of what you can do in your own sparring to make sure that you're giving credit to your opponent when they land something, and there's no judge to give them credit for, but at the same time, you're keeping yourself safe and you're continuing to spar. You're continuing to fight and you're continuing to put yourself in that mindset of, I'm not necessarily trying to win, but I'm continuing to try to stay alive as though I was trying to win. This is an important thing that everyone can do in their own sparring right now. Every single time you end an exchange in sparring, continue to cover yourself, not hit, but cover yourself one exchange after you think you're done. The result is that you're probably going to parry a bunch more after blows that you didn't think, mattered. But at the same time, you're also going to put yourself more than halfway to that end state where in tournaments you can go, okay, I'm not only going to defend myself one step after I think it's done, I'm also going to try to throw a counterattack one step after I think it's done. And it's a very, very small, subtle difference that can be changed pretty easily in the context of sparring, but not one that can be changed if you never ever thought about doing anything after the halt or after you thought the exchange was over in the first place. So if you're looking at your own footage and you're seeing yourself do this all the time, remember that this is something you can change every single time you spar. Always go one step after the halt. Start with going one defense after the halt. And if you find that you have the control and you have the discipline to maybe go one step further, one counterattack after the halt. And you'll find that you're not going to have this problem of pausing anymore. So this is the last exchange I'm going to cover, and the reason I'm going to cover it isn't because it really illustrates the concept of shot selection, distance and timing, or errors, but because it illustrates an adaptation. What we see here is that Josh on the right provokes an attack on his right side, MJ's left side, because he wants MJ to do the thing that he has shown he is going to do over and over again, which is shift from his right plow into his left ox. And while he was doing that shift, Josh simply taps him in the arm and then backs out of measure. And MJ, who is still in the middle of trying to transition from his right plow to his left ox, finds that he has no options. The reason this was so successful as an exchange is because Josh interpreted and understood the shot selection, the distance and timing, and the errors that he was seeing from his opponent, and he adapted to them. He used different techniques or changed up his own distance and timing, or maybe removed some of his own errors in order to try to get the better of not only this exchange, but any exchange in the future. And these adaptations are really the reason why I made this channel in the first place, because I saw a lot of people at the highest level of fencing making these changes on the fly in real time, and that was very impressive. But what a lot of people don't understand is that these adaptations are, in my opinion, the number one thing that separates a newer fencer who is getting a good cabal of techniques that they love to use, and an intermediate or even advanced fencer who is utilizing those techniques to win tournaments. And while I'm not the kind of person to tell you that people who win tournaments are always the best fencers or the best interpreters of historical European martial arts, I will tell you that people who can adapt are 100% the best people to talk to if you want to understand how to properly utilize and execute the techniques that are set out in the texts. If you want to be the best historical European martial artist that you can be, you have to be able to adapt. And that means you not only have to have a robust understanding of the system that you're learning, but you also have to have a robust understanding of the other systems that other people use, even when they don't think they're using a system. Because if you can't adapt to what your opponent is showing you, you can't properly select which techniques from your own system to use in any given situation. And as you probably already know, my answer to this is sparring games. And the reason sparring games are the answer is because they take you from that first level of learning HEMA to that next level of really interpreting HEMA. What I mean by that is take MJ as a perfect example. He is doing exactly what he has been trained to do, likely over and over and over again in class. And that is not to say that what he is being taught in class is wrong. It is not wrong at all. It is exactly right. Every technique that MJ chose had logic to it. It was a good selection of technique. Sometimes the distance and timing was off, but that's okay. That happens to everybody. Sometimes there's a little bit of an error. Again, happens to everybody. But the real reason that MJ probably doesn't see the kind of success that he wants to in tournaments is because he does not know how to adapt. And in this particular case, he doesn't know how to adapt himself to fit the opponent, and most importantly, because he was not taught to adapt during class. So in my opinion, if you want to take that next step from beginner to intermediate fencer, what you absolutely have to do is you have to start putting yourself into sparring situations, sparring games, where you focus entirely on these adaptations. You have to reach a certain point where you accept that my left plow, my right ox, my zverkow, my shielhow isn't really going to get that much better anymore. You have already crossed your beginner level from I didn't know how to throw this technique at all to I'm landing it pretty consistently. The difference between you right now and the absolute best in the game at that technique is maybe 5-10%. That 5-10% is not the reason those people are so successful with these techniques. So instead of drilling your shielhow over and over and over again, trying to make up that gap, work on sparring games where you want your shielhow to be the answer to an adaptation that you're making against your opponent. Learn which guards the shielhow works well against. Not try to drill your shielhow so hard that you can throw it against anyone at any time, because that will never happen. You have to be able to take yourself from that beginner level understanding of getting better at the sport of I need to drill more techniques to I need to drill more adaptations. I need to drill more flows. I need to drill more situations where I see myself selecting the wrong shots, being out of distance and timing, and throwing these common errors, not because I can get rid of them, but because I'm doing them at the wrong time against the wrong person. If I can make it so that I only error out when I'm fencing someone who does the exact same thing, doesn't matter. All you have to be able to do is be better than the person you're facing right now. And if you can adapt, it will never matter how good you are at individual techniques or footwork or whether or not you never freeze. All that's going to matter is that you are able to change up what those things are, sometimes just subtly, so that you can overcome the barriers and the challenges that you are facing right then. So, if you think I'm wrong, feel free to say so, but hopefully we're going to get Gazelle Infected footage soon, and I'm going to go back to interpreting tournament footage. But I really do want to emphasize that the reason that I made this channel wasn't just to try to make a, video essay style, save the date of tournaments. I don't just want to worship tournament fencers. I want people to understand that this barrier here that they think exists between them and the very best really isn't that much of a barrier at all. Anybody can become a top-level HEMA fencer right now. If they get 2 or 3 techniques that they do at an advanced level, and most importantly, can adapt those techniques to fit whatever their opponent happens to be showing them. If you can do that, you can make it all the way to the top. And that's because right now, there is a serious shortage of people who are teaching new fencers how to be that. So, if you want to be one of the best, try to take my advice. I really hope it works out for you, and I will see you on Thursday.